At the beginning of the 13th century, the remarkable civilization of Languedoc flourished in southern France, where different religions coexisted peacefully and troubadours created sophisticated poetry. But amid this cultural diversity, a religious movement arose that the Church considered a mortal threat. The Cathars, who called themselves pure, possessed an alternative understanding of Christianity and, possibly, secret knowledge capable of undermining the foundations of papal power. Their teachings on dualism and criticism of church corruption resonated throughout Languedoc. When diplomacy failed to stop the spread of heresy, Pope Innocent III took the unprecedented decision to declare a crusade against Christians in the heart of Europe. A 20-year war began, which not only destroyed the Cathar movement, but also wiped out an entire civilization. Subscribe to our channel to learn more about the hidden pages of history. Share your opinion in the comments. Did the Cathars really possess secret knowledge that threatened the Church? Or was it just a typical struggle for political power under religious slogans? At the beginning of the 13th century, southern France was a unique cultural and religious world, radically different from the northern regions of the kingdom. Languedoc, a historical region named after the Occitan language, which the locals called the language of OK, was a thriving region with developed cities, flourishing trade, and its own cultural traditions. It was here that troubadour poetry originated, exquisite works of courtly literature were created, and religious life was remarkably diverse. The political map of Languedoc resembled a patchwork quilt of small counties, duchies, and city communes. The largest feudal estates were the county of Toulouse, under the rule of the Saint-Gilles dynasty, the viscounties of Béziers and Carcassonne, the county of Foix, and many smaller seigneuries. Unlike northern France, where royal power was gradually strengthening, the south retained its feudal fragmentation and considerable autonomy from the central government. A distinctive feature of Languedoc culture was its remarkable religious diversity. Catholic parishes coexisted peacefully with communities of Waldensians, followers of Pierre Valdo of Lyon, various mystical sects, and, most importantly for our history, numerous communities of Cathars. The Catholic Church in the region was relatively weak, and the local clergy often had a low level of education and moral decline, which created fertile ground for alternative religious movements. The economic prosperity of Languedoc was based on developed trade, craft production, and a favorable geographical location at the crossroads of trade routes between the Mediterranean and northern Europe. The cities of Toulouse, Béziers, Carcassonne, Albi, and Narbonne were major trading centers where merchants from Italy, Spain, Flanders, and other European regions met. The region's wealth fueled not only trade, but also cultural life. It was in this atmosphere of prosperity and relative freedom that the Cathar movement spread widely, which would become the main cause of the tragic events of the following decades. The Cathars, also known as Albigensians after the city of Albi, one of the centers of their influence, were not just a religious sect, but an entire alternative worldview that challenged official Catholic doctrine. The religious situation was exacerbated by political ambitions. The Pope sought to strengthen his power over all of Christian Europe. The French kings dreamed of expanding their possessions to the south, and the northern French nobility looked enviously at the riches of Languedoc. This complex intertwining of religious, political, and economic interests led to a conflict that would soon turn into one of the bloodiest wars of the Middle Ages. The cultural uniqueness of Languedoc was evident not only in the religious sphere, but also in language, customs, and architecture. The Occitan language differed significantly from Old French, and it was used to create poetic works that influenced the development of literature throughout Europe. Troubadours sang of courtly love and knightly ideals, and created a refined poetic culture that would find its continuation in the works of Dante and other great poets. The architecture of the region also had its own characteristics, combining Romanesque traditions with influences from Arab art that penetrated through Spain. The fortresses and castles of Languedoc were built taking into account local conditions and military needs, and many of them would become key points in future battles. The Cathar movement originated in the mid-12th century as a religious philosophical movement with roots deep in ancient dualistic teachings. The name Cathars comes from the Greek word kataros, meaning pure, although they themselves preferred to call themselves simply Christians or good people. They sincerely considered themselves true followers of Christ, purified of material, temptations and church corruption, which, in their opinion, distorted the original Christian message. Cathar theology was based on fundamental dualism, which assumed the existence of two equal and opposite principles, good and evil. According to their teachings, the good God created the spiritual world, souls, and everything invisible, while the evil demiurge, often identified with Satan or the Old Testament God, created the material world with all its suffering, disease, and death. The human soul, which originally belonged to the spiritual world of good, found itself imprisoned in a material body as a result of a cosmic catastrophe or deception by the evil principle. This cosmology was radically different from the Catholic doctrine of a single creator God. The Cathars denied that the material world could have been created by a good God, because they saw too much evil and suffering in it. Their goal was to free the soul from material captivity and return it to the spiritual world through a process of purification and renunciation of all material things. The practical embodiment of Cathar beliefs was the rite of consolamentum, spiritual baptism, which differed radically from the Catholic sacrament of baptism. Consolamentum was performed only for adults who were capable of consciously taking the strictest religious vows. This rite symbolized death to the material world and birth to the spiritual world. A person who accepted consolamentum became perfect and was obliged to live in absolute purity. The Cathar community was divided into two main strata: the perfect and the believers, or credentes. The perfect ones who had undergone consolamentum took severe vows: complete abstinence from meat and dairy products, celibacy, prohibition of lying, oaths, and any form of violence, including the killing of animals. They could not own property, devoting their lives to prayer, preaching, and serving the community. Perfect men were called good men, and women were called good women. Believers, credentes, made up the majority of the Cathar community and could lead normal lives, marry, trade, and own property. However, they were required to confess regularly to the perfect ones, participate in religious ceremonies, and financially support the community. Many credentes postponed taking the consolamentum until their deathbed in order to die in a state of spiritual purity. The Cathars rejected most Catholic sacraments and dogmas. They did not recognize the cross as a symbol of faith, considering it an instrument of execution, did not venerate material shrines and icons, and denied the doctrine of purgatory and the intercession of saints. The Cathars were especially critical of the Catholic clergy for their pursuit of wealth, political influence, and moral depravity. Cathar worship services were held in simple homes or outdoors, without elaborate ceremonies. The main element of the service was the reading and interpretation of the New Testament, especially the Gospel of John, which they considered the most spiritual. The Cathars had their own translations of the Bible into Occitan, which also contradicted the Catholic practice of using Latin exclusively. The social appeal of Catharism was explained not only by its spiritual ideas, but also by its criticism of church corruption. At a time when Catholic prelates lived in luxury, engaged in politics and the trade in indulgences, the asceticism and moral purity of the Cathar perfects made a strong impression on ordinary people, and even on the nobility. By the end of the 12th century, the Cathar movement had reached unprecedented proportions in Languedoc, penetrating all strata of society and creating an alternative religious structure that began to seriously compete with the official Catholic Church. The cities of Albi, Carcassonne, Toulouse, and Béziers became true centers of Cathar preaching, where the perfect ones openly conducted services and performed religious rites. The spread of Catharism among the nobility was particularly impressive. Many influential families in Languedoc not only patronized the movement, but also took an active part in its activities. Esclarmonde de Foix, sister of the Count of Foix, became one of the most famous Cathar preachers. The Viscountess of Carcassonne supported Cathar communities by providing them with protection and material assistance. Even in the family of the Counts of Toulouse, Cathar ideas found sympathy, although the rulers themselves officially remained Catholic. The social base of Catharism was extremely broad. The movement attracted not only the aristocracy, but also urban artisans, merchants, and peasants. Catharism spread particularly actively among the educated strata of the population, notaries, doctors, and teachers, who appreciated the opportunity to read the Holy Scriptures in their native language and participate in religious discussions. Women in Cathar communities enjoyed significantly greater rights than in the Catholic Church, which also contributed to the movement's growing popularity. By the end of the 12th century, there were several Cathar bishoprics in Languedoc with their own church hierarchy. The Cathar bishop of Toulouse, Joubert de Castres, ruled over a vast territory, while the Cathar bishops of Carcassonne and Albi held equally influential positions. This parallel church organization functioned openly, held councils, ordained clergy, and even collected tithes from believers. The Catholic Church's reaction to the spread of Catharism was ambiguous. Initially, the church authorities tried to combat heresy using traditional methods, preaching, debates, and attempts to convert heretics. In 1179, the Third Lateran Council officially condemned the Cathars and called for a fight against them, but these measures proved insufficient. The Cistercian monk Arnaud Amalric, who would later become one of the leaders of the Crusade, was particularly active in the fight against Catharism. He organized public debates with Cathar preachers, trying to refute their teachings, but these events often ended in triumph for the Cathars, who demonstrated a deep knowledge of Scripture and an ability to engage in theological debate. The failure of diplomatic methods forced the Church to seek more radical solutions. Pope Innocent III, who ascended the throne in 1198, considered the Cathar problem a priority from the very beginning of his pontificate. He understood that the spread of an alternative Christian doctrine in a rich and influential region of Europe posed a mortal threat to papal authority. Innocent began by exerting diplomatic pressure on the secular rulers of Languedoc. He demanded that Count Raymond VI of Toulouse and the Viscounts of Béziers and Carcassonne take active measures against the Cathars in their territories. However, local rulers, many of whom sympathized with the Cathars, or at least tolerated them, shied away from decisive action. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Cathars enjoyed support not only among the laity, but also among part of the Catholic clergy. Many parish priests in Languedoc were distinguished by their low level of education and moral laxity, which created a striking contrast with the ascetic lifestyle of the Cathar perfects. The Pope's attempts to reform the local clergy also met with resistance. The growing influence of Catharism began to threaten not only the spiritual authority of the Church, but also its material interests. Cathar communities did not pay church tithes, did not donate to the construction of Catholic churches, and did not buy indulgences. Moreover, the Cathars' criticism of the Church's wealth and the secular interests of the clergy undermined the authority of the Catholic hierarchy among the general population. The political map of Languedoc at the beginning of the 13th century was a complex mosaic of feudal estates, each of which enjoyed considerable autonomy and had its own interests. The central figure in this system was Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, from the Saint-Gilles dynasty, whose possessions stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the foothills of the Pyrenees. However, Raymond's real power over his nominal vassals was very limited, which created favorable conditions for religious and political separatism. The Viscounts of Béziers and Carcassonne from the Trinquevel family controlled strategically important territories in the central part of Languedoc. Their capitals, Carcassonne and Béziers, were not only powerful fortresses, but also thriving commercial centers. Viscount Raymond Roger Trinquevel, a young and ambitious ruler, supported the Cathar communities on his lands, seeing this as a way to counter the growing influence of the French crown and the papacy. In the east of the region, Count Raymond Roger of Foix wielded considerable influence, his mountain estates serving as a safe haven for persecuted Cathars. The Count's family openly patronized heretics, and the Count's sister, Esclarmonde, became one of the most influential Cathar preachers. These mountainous territories, with their numerous castles and inaccessible passes, posed a serious problem for any attempts at military intervention. The economic prosperity of Languedoc was based on developed trade and craft production. The cities of the region maintained active trade links with Italy, Spain, and the Levant. Toulouse was one of the largest cities in Europe, with a population of about 80,000. The ports of Narbonne and Montpellier served as gateways for Mediterranean trade. This economic power allowed local rulers to pursue independent policies and resist external pressure. The social structure of Languedoc society differed from the northern French model in that it was more mobile and relatively less dependent on the seigneurial system. Cities enjoyed extensive self-government rights, and urban communes often acted as independent political entities. Merchant guilds and craft corporations had considerable influence on local politics. This social dynamism created a favorable environment for the spread of new ideas, including Cathar religious teachings. The cultural life of Languedoc was flourishing. The courts of local lords became centers of courtly poetry, where famous troubadours created their works. Bertrand de Born, Arnaud Daniel, Peyre Vidal, and many other poets created works in the Occitan language that influenced the development of European literature. This cultural identity also served as a unifying factor for the Languedoc nobility in confronting external threats. The religious situation in the region was characterized by remarkable tolerance. Catholic parishes, Waldensians, and Jewish communities operated alongside Cathar communities. Such religious diversity was unthinkable in other parts of medieval Europe and reflected the general atmosphere of intellectual freedom that prevailed in Languedoc. Many members of the nobility maintained friendly relations with the leaders of various religious groups. However, this outward harmony concealed growing contradictions. The Catholic Church increasingly demanded that the secular authorities take decisive action against heretics. The French crown, which sought centralization, saw the independence of the southern feudal lords as an obstacle to its plans. The northern French nobility looked enviously at the riches of Languedoc and dreamed of military spoils. The situation was made particularly acute by the fact that many Languedoc lords were vassals not only of the French king, but also of the King of Aragon or the English King Duke of Aquitaine. This complex system of suzerainty created a constant threat of international conflict. King Peter II of Aragon had feudal rights to a number of territories in Languedoc and viewed any attempts at French expansion as a threat to his interests. The internal political situation was complicated by rivalry between different branches of the ruling dynasties. Within the family of the Counts of Toulouse, there were disagreements over the attitude towards the Cathars and the policy towards the Church. Similar contradictions existed in other noble families, which weakened their ability to resist external threats in a united manner. Pope Innocent III, realizing the scale of the Cathar threat, initially tried to resolve the problem through diplomatic means. In 1199, he sent special legates to Languedoc with broad powers to combat heresy. The mission was led by the Cistercian abbot Arnaud Amalric, a man of fanatical faith and iron will, who was to become one of the key figures in the future tragedy. The Pope's initial strategy was based on reforming the local Catholic clergy and strengthening preaching activities against the Cathars. The legates found the church in Languedoc to be in a depressing state. Many priests were illiterate, led dissolute lives, and openly traded church offices. Against the backdrop of the ascetic lifestyle of the Cathar perfects, such clergy made an extremely negative impression on the flock. Arnaud Amalric and his assistants launched an active campaign to purify the ranks of the church. They removed unworthy priests, appointed new bishops, and tried to raise the educational level of the clergy. However, these measures were met with resistance not only from the corrupt clergy, but also from the local nobility, who had long been accustomed to controlling church appointments in their domains. The church placed particular hope in preaching. The best theologians of the time were sent to Languedoc, including the future Saint Dominic de Guzman, founder of the Dominican order. Public debates were organized between Catholic preachers and Cathar perfected ones, but these events often ended in a moral victory for the heretics, who demonstrated excellent knowledge of the Holy Scriptures and persuasiveness in theological disputes. The famous debate in Montreal in 1207 became a symbol of the failures of Catholic diplomacy. For several days, Catholic theologians tried to convince the Cathar preachers in front of a large audience. However, the Cathars not only successfully defended their positions, but also accused the Catholic Church of deviating from the ideals of the Gospel. Many of the nobles present openly expressed sympathy for the Cathar arguments. The central problem for papal diplomacy was the attitude of the secular rulers of Languedoc. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse took an ambiguous position. Officially, he remained a Catholic and formally recognized the papal demands. But in practice, he continued to patronize the Cathars. His court was full of heretics. His wife Elvira of Aragon openly sympathized with Cathar teachings, and many of his advisors and military leaders were Cathars. Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel took an even more openly pro-Cathar position. The young and energetic ruler saw support for the heretics as a way to assert his independence from the French crown and the papacy. His capital, Carcassonne, became one of the main centers of Cathar preaching, where the perfected felt completely safe. Papal legates tried to put pressure on the rebellious lords using traditional church sanctions. Interdict was imposed on entire territories, and some rulers were excommunicated, but these measures proved ineffective. The local population, a significant part of which sympathized with the Cathars, ignored the church's prohibitions. Many Catholic priests also violated the interdict, fearing they would lose their flock. The critical point in relations between the papacy and Languedoc was the murder of the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau in 1208. The legate was returning from another unsuccessful meeting with Count Raymond of Toulouse when he was killed by an unknown assailant on the banks of the Rhône near Arles. Although there was no direct evidence of the Count's involvement in the murder, Pope Innocent III immediately accused Raymond of organizing the crime. This murder was the last straw that broke the Pope's patience. Innocent realized that diplomatic methods had exhausted themselves, and that the Cathar heresy was not only not weakening, but continuing to grow stronger. Moreover, the open defiance of the secular rulers of Languedoc set a dangerous precedent for other regions of Europe. If the Pope failed to deal with the Cathar problem, it could undermine his authority throughout the Christian world. There were also objective reasons for the failure of church diplomacy. By the beginning of the 13th century, the Cathar movement was firmly rooted in the social and cultural life of Languedoc. It enjoyed the support not only of the common people, but also of a significant part of the nobility, who saw it as a symbol of their independence from external pressure. The murder of the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau on January 14, 1208, was a turning point in the history of relations between Rome and Languedoc. Pope Innocent III, upon receiving news of the death of his representative, made a decision that would change the fate of an entire region and lead to one of the bloodiest wars of the Middle Ages. On March 10, 1209, he issued a bull calling for a crusade against the Cathars and their patrons. The papal bull was a revolutionary document proclaiming for the first time in history a crusade against Christians on European soil. Previously, crusades had been directed against Muslims in the Holy Land or against pagans in the Baltic region, but never against European Christians, even heretics. Innocent III justified this unprecedented step by the need to defend the true faith from the mortal threat posed by the Cathar heresy. The terms of the crusade were extremely attractive to the knights of northern France. The Pope promised all participants full absolution, the same as that received by crusaders who went to the Holy Land. Moreover, the lands of heretics and their patrons were declared confiscated, and any crusader could claim ownership of them. This effectively meant legalized looting of the wealthy Languedoc under the guise of religious war. The papal bull freed the crusaders from all debts for the duration of the campaign and guaranteed the church's protection of their property and families during their absence. The minimum term of service was set at 40 days, significantly less than for campaigns in Palestine. These conditions made the Albigensian Crusade an extremely attractive venture for impoverished knights of northern France who dreamed of easy money. The religious propaganda that accompanied the call to arms portrayed the Cathars as dangerous heretics who threatened the foundations of Christian civilization. Church preachers claimed that the Cathars rejected all Christian sacraments, worshipped the devil, and practiced ritual murder. Many of these accusations were exaggerated or completely false, but they created the necessary emotional atmosphere for a holy war. The papal call was met with a massive rise in the Crusader movement throughout northern France and neighboring regions. Representatives of the highest nobility joined the campaign. Duke Eudes III of Burgundy, the Count of Nevers, the Count of Neuchâtel, and numerous barons from Champagne, Île-de-France, and Normandy. German knights, attracted by the prospect of easy conquests, were particularly active. The papal legate Arnaud Amalric, abbot of Citeaux, a man of fanatical religiosity and iron will, was appointed the nominal leader of the crusade. However, the actual military command was exercised by Count Simon de Montfort, an ambitious Norman baron who would become the central figure of the Albigensian Wars. Simon was an experienced warrior who had participated in the Fourth Crusade, although he had left it because of the Crusaders' attack on Christian Constantinople. Organizing the crusade required considerable resources. The Church collected special taxes, sold indulgences, and solicited donations. Monasteries were ordered to provide material support for the Holy War. An extensive logistical system was created to supply the army during the long campaign. The Crusader army, which gathered in Lyon in the summer of 1209, numbered about 20,000 men. It included both heavily armed knights, who were the striking force of medieval armies, and numerous infantry recruited from urban craftsmen and peasants. Siege specialists and engineers, who were necessary for storming the fortified cities of Languedoc, played a special role. The psychological preparation of the Crusaders included not only religious propaganda, but also the formation of an image of the enemy. The Cathars were portrayed not simply as heretics, but as enemies of the entire Christian world, posing a mortal threat to the Church and society. This demonization of the enemy was intended to justify any cruelty during the war. The international situation was favorable for the crusade. King Philip II, Augustus of France, did not formally participate in the campaign, as he was busy with the war against King John Lackland of England, but he did not hinder the actions of the Crusaders. The English king was also too busy with his own problems to interfere in southern French affairs. The German Emperor Otto IV was in conflict with the Pope and could not influence the situation. The Crusader army set out from Lyon in June 1209, moving along the Rhône Valley towards the borders of Languedoc. The first target of the campaign was the city of Béziers, one of the most important centers of the Cathar movement in the Viscountcy of Trinquevel. The choice of this target was not accidental. Béziers symbolized the wealth and independence of southern French civilization, and its fall was intended to demonstrate to the whole of Languedoc the inevitability of divine punishment for heresy. Viscount Raymond Roger Trinquevel, the young ruler of Carcassonne and Béziers, was in an extremely difficult position. He was only 24 years old and had inherited power only a few years earlier. Attempts to resolve the conflict diplomatically had been unsuccessful. The papal legate Arnaud Amalric demanded the extradition of all Cathars in his domain, which effectively meant betraying a significant portion of the Viscount's subjects. The Crusaders approached Béziers on July 21, 1209. The city was a powerful fortress located on a high hill above the Orbe River. Its walls were considered impregnable. The garrison was well prepared for a siege, and food supplies were sufficient to withstand a long blockade. The inhabitants of Béziers, both Catholics and Cathars, were determined to resist to the end. The siege began with attempts at negotiation. The Crusaders offered to spare the rest of the population in exchange for the surrender of all heretics. The city authorities categorically rejected this demand, stating that they did not distinguish between their fellow citizens on religious grounds. This position reflected a characteristic feature of Languedoc civilization, where religious tolerance was the norm in public life. The events of July 22nd unfolded rapidly and tragically. In the morning, a small group of defenders of the city made a sortie against the Crusader camp. This attack was repelled, but in pursuit of the retreating defenders, the Crusaders broke into the city through a poorly defended gate. What was planned as a long siege turned into an unexpected assault. The massacre that followed the capture of Béziers shocked contemporaries with its cruelty. The Crusaders spared neither women, children, nor the elderly. When the soldiers asked Legate Arnaud Amalric how to distinguish Catholics from heretics, he replied, according to the Chronicle, "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." This phrase became a symbol of the fanaticism of the Crusades, although its historical accuracy is disputed among historians. According to various sources, between 15,000 and 20,000 people died in Béziers. The city was looted and burned to the ground. The Crusaders showed particular cruelty in the main cathedral, where thousands of townspeople had sought refuge. None of those who hid there survived. The material wealth accumulated by generations of inhabitants of this prosperous trading city became the spoils of the victors. News of the tragedy in Béziers spread instantly throughout Languedoc, sowing panic and terror. Many small towns and castles immediately surrendered to the Crusaders without waiting for a siege. Residents fled their homes, escaping to the mountains or taking refuge in large fortresses. The traditional way of life of an entire region was destroyed within a few weeks. The next target of the Crusaders was Carcassonne, the capital of the Viscountcy of Trinquevel and one of the most beautiful cities of medieval Europe. Unlike Béziers, this city was prepared for a long siege. Viscount Raymond Roger concentrated significant military forces here, replenished food and water supplies, and strengthened the city walls. The siege of Carcassonne began in early August 1209. The city was located on a dominant height, and its powerful walls and towers presented a serious obstacle to the attackers. However, the Crusaders had numerical superiority and modern siege engines. The lack of water created particular difficulties for the besieged, as the Crusaders managed to cut off the city's main water sources. After a 2-week siege, the defenders' situation became critical. Epidemics broke out, food supplies were running low, and the morale of the inhabitants was falling. Viscount Raymond Roger agreed to negotiations, hoping to find a compromise solution. However, these negotiations turned out to be a trap for him. He was treacherously arrested by the Crusaders during a meeting under the banner of truce. The massacre in Béziers on July 22, 1209, became a symbol of the extreme cruelty of the Albigensian Crusade and forever changed the nature of military operations in Languedoc. This tragic day demonstrated that the holy war against heretics had turned into the merciless extermination of entire cities, making no distinction between soldiers and civilians, between Catholics and Cathars. On the morning of July 22nd, the defenders of Béziers made a desperate sortie against the Crusader camp. A small detachment of townspeople attempted to attack the siege engines and inflict damage on the enemy before the assault began. This attack was poorly planned and doomed to failure, but it triggered a chain of events that led to disaster. The Crusaders easily repelled the attack and rushed to pursue the retreating defenders. In the confusion of the pursuit, the city gates were not closed in time, and the Crusaders broke into Béziers along with the fleeing defenders. What was supposed to be a long and difficult siege turned into an unexpected capture of the city. The suddenness of this success took even the Crusader commanders by surprise, who lost control of their troops in the first minutes of the assault. The mass murder began immediately. The Crusaders, inspired by their easy victory and incited by religious fanaticism, set about destroying all living things in the city. The narrow medieval streets turned into places of slaughter, where there was no mercy for age or gender. Residents tried to hide in churches, basements, and attics, but the Crusaders methodically searched every house. The events in the main cathedral of Béziers, dedicated to Saint Nazaire, were particularly tragic. Thousands of townspeople, men, women, children, and the elderly, sought refuge within the sacred walls, hoping that the Crusaders would spare those who had taken shelter in the house of God. However, the fanatical warriors broke into the cathedral, turning it into a place of mass murder. Chronicles report that about 7,000 people died in the cathedral. Papal legate Arnaud Amalric, the nominal leader of the crusade, not only did not try to stop the massacre, but, according to a number of sources, actually blessed it. He is credited with the famous phrase "Cedit eos," "Novit enim Dominus qui sunt eius," "Kill them all, the Lord will know his own." Although the accuracy of this quote is disputed among historians, it reflects the spirit of the crusade and the attitude of the church authorities towards heretics. The looting of the city continued for several days. Béziers was one of the richest trading centers in Languedoc, and its treasures attracted many crusaders. Jewels, works of art, expensive fabrics, and stocks of goods all became the spoils of the victors. Many participants in the campaign became rich in the first days of the war, which served as a powerful incentive to continue the hostilities. The destruction of the city was completed by setting it on fire. The flames engulfed the wooden buildings, turning the prosperous trading center into smoldering ruins. Archaeological research confirms the extent of the destruction. The layer of the fire of 1209 is clearly visible in the cultural strata of Béziers. It took decades for the city to recover, and some neighborhoods were never rebuilt. News of the massacre in Béziers spread like wildfire throughout Languedoc, sowing panic and terror among the population. Many towns and castles immediately surrendered without waiting for the Crusaders to arrive. Residents abandoned their homes, fleeing to the mountains or taking refuge in the most fortified cities. The traditional life of the region was paralyzed by fear. The tragedy of Béziers had far-reaching political consequences. It demonstrated the true goals of the crusade, not simply the fight against heresy, but the conquest and colonization of the wealthy Languedoc. The local nobility realized that this was not about religious reform, but about the complete destruction of their world. This realization led to the consolidation of resistance and turned the religious war into a national liberation struggle. The massacre also influenced international perceptions of the conflict. Even in an era accustomed to military cruelty, the scale of the killings in Béziers was condemned. King Pedro II of Aragon, nominally an ally of the Pope in the fight against the Muslims, began to reconsider his attitude towards the crusade, seeing it as a threat to his feudal possessions in Languedoc. After the capture of Carcassonne in August 1209, the Crusaders faced the problem of governing the conquered territories. Most of the participants in the campaign, including the highest nobility, having fulfilled their 40-day vow, were preparing to return home with rich spoils. However, maintaining control of the captured lands required constant military supervision, and the papal legate Arnaud Amalric proposed transferring the viscountcy of Trinquevel to one of the military leaders of the crusade. The choice fell on Simon de Montfort, Count of Ile-de-France, who had demonstrated outstanding military abilities and a willingness to remain in Languedoc to continue the Holy War. Simon came from a noble Norman family, owned lands in England and France, and was an experienced warrior and skilled administrator. His appointment as Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne marked the beginning of a new phase in the Albigensian Wars. Simon de Montfort was a controversial figure. His contemporaries described him as a deeply religious man, ascetic in his daily life, fair to his subjects, but merciless to his enemies. He sincerely believed in the sanctity of his mission to eradicate heresy and was prepared to use any means necessary to achieve this goal. His military talent was combined with political foresight and organizational skills. Simon's main opponent was Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, who, after being forced to reconcile with the Church in 1209, gradually returned to supporting the Cathars. Raymond was an experienced diplomat and politician who knew how to maneuver between different forces, but he was inferior to Simon in military art. The conflict between these two men determined the course of the war for many years. The first years of Simon's reign in Languedoc were characterized by the methodical expansion of the territory under his control. He captured numerous castles and cities, created an effective administrative system, and attracted settlers from the north to colonize the conquered lands. His military tactics were based on speed of movement, concentration of forces at decisive points, and ruthlessness towards those who resisted. Simon encountered particularly fierce resistance in the mountainous regions of the county of Foix, ruled by Count Raymond Roger de Foix, one of the most consistent defenders of the Cathars. Esclarmonde de Foix, the Count's sister and an influential Cathar preacher, turned her court into a center of spiritual resistance to the Crusaders. The mountain castles of the county, Foix, Montségur, and Lourdes, became impregnable refuges for the persecuted heretics. The turning point in the military operations was the Battle of Muret on September 12, 1213. King Pedro II of Aragon, concerned about the growing French influence in Languedoc and defending his vassals, entered the war on the side of the Languedoc lords. His army, joined by the forces of Count Raymond of Toulouse and other southern French magnates, laid siege to the castle of Muret, where a small garrison of Simon's supporters was stationed. The forces were extremely unequal. The Aragonese Languedoc army numbered about 34,000 men, including 4,000 heavily armed knights, while Simon de Montfort had only about 900 horsemen and a small number of infantry. However, Simon decided on a desperate maneuver, a surprise attack on the superior forces of the enemy. The battle began with a daring cavalry attack by the Crusaders on the besieging camp. Simon personally led his knights into battle, using the element of surprise and concentrating the attack on a single point. The Aragonese and Languedoc troops, caught off guard, were unable to mount an effective resistance. During the battle, King Pedro of Aragon was killed, which led to panic and the flight of his army. The victory at Muret made Simon de Montfort the master of most of Languedoc. Count Raymond of Toulouse fled to England, and many castles surrendered without resistance. Simon was recognized as Duke of Narbonne and Count of Toulouse, receiving formal recognition from the French King Philip II Augustus. It seemed that the Cathar heresy and the independence of Languedoc had been finally crushed. However, Simon's triumph was short-lived. The cruelty of his rule, high taxes, and religious persecution caused increasing discontent among the local population. In 1216, Count Raymond returned from exile and led a new uprising against the northern French conquerors. The war entered a new phase. The death of Simon de Montfort on June 25, 1218, during the siege of Toulouse, was a turning point in the Albigensian Wars. The great military leader, who had ruled Languedoc for 20 years, was killed by a stone fired from a city catapult during the assault. His death inspired the defenders of Toulouse and all opponents of the Crusade, showing that the northern French conquerors were not invincible. Simon's heir was his eldest son, Amaury de Montfort, a man less talented and decisive than his father. Amaury inherited his father's titles, Count of Toulouse, Duke of Narbonne, Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne, but did not inherit his military abilities and political authority. The position of the northern French crusaders in Languedoc began to deteriorate rapidly. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse and his son Raymond VII led a large-scale uprising against the Crusaders. One after another, the cities and castles of Languedoc expelled the northern French garrisons and returned to the rule of local lords. By 1221, Amaury de Montfort controlled only a few fortresses, and his financial situation had become critical. In this situation, Amaury made a decision that radically changed the nature of the conflict. He turned to King Louis VIII of France for help, offering to transfer all his rights to the Languedoc lands in exchange for military support. The French crown had long sought to expand its holdings to the south, and Amaury's offer provided an excellent opportunity for the legal annexation of a rich region. Louis VIII, nicknamed the Lion for his belligerence, was an energetic ruler who sought to strengthen royal power and expand his domain. He viewed the Albigensian question not only as a religious problem, but also as a convenient pretext for French expansion to the south. Participation in a holy war against heretics ensured him the support of the Church and moral justification for his policy of conquest. Preparations for the Royal Crusade required considerable resources and time. Louis gathered troops throughout northern France, formed alliances with neighboring monarchs, and secured funding for the expedition. Pope Honorius III granted the king all the privileges of the Crusaders and promised the Church's support. By the spring of 1226, the French army was ready to march. The Royal Army, which entered Languedoc in May 1226, significantly surpassed all previous crusading expeditions in terms of numbers and organization. It included the best military forces of France, the Royal Guard, detachments of the largest feudal lords, mercenary units, and siege equipment. The total number of troops reached 50,000, making it one of the largest armies in medieval Europe. Louis's strategy was radically different from the tactics of previous crusades. Instead of raids and short expeditions, the king planned to systematically conquer and incorporate Languedoc into the French kingdom. The goal was not just to suppress heresy, but to create a strong administrative and military system that would ensure long-term control over the region. The military campaign of 1226 was successful for the French. The cities of Languedoc surrendered one after another to the king's superior forces. Avignon was taken after a 3-month siege, accompanied by brutal repression of the population. Many castles surrendered without a fight, their owners preferring compromise with the king to open resistance. Count Raymond VII of Toulouse found himself in a hopeless situation. His army could not withstand the royal troops in open battle. His allies were defecting to Louis one after another, and his financial resources were running out. The international situation was also not favorable for resistance. England was preoccupied with internal problems, and Aragon was unable to provide effective assistance after its defeat at Muret. However, Louis's plans were disrupted by his sudden death on November 8, 1226, in Montpensier on his way back from a campaign. The king fell ill with dysentery during the siege of Avignon and died at the age of 39. His death temporarily halted French expansion and gave the defenders of Languedoc's independence a respite. The death of King Louis VIII in 1226 did not stop French expansion in Languedoc, but it significantly changed its nature. The 12-year-old Louis IX, the future Saint Louis, ascended the throne, and the regency passed to his mother, the energetic Blanche of Castile. The Queen Regent was determined to complete her late husband's work and finally subjugate the rebellious South to the French crown. Blanche of Castile proved to be an outstanding politician and military strategist. She managed to preserve the unity of the kingdom during the difficult period of the monarch's minority, suppress the rebellions of the great feudal lords, and continue the policy of conquest in Languedoc. Her methods were more flexible than those of her predecessors. She skillfully combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiations, offering acceptable terms to those who were willing to submit. Count Raymond VII of Toulouse used the respite caused by the change of power in Paris to rebuild his forces. He regained control of Toulouse and a significant part of his hereditary possessions, formed alliances with other Languedoc lords, and sought support from the English king Henry III. However, his position remained extremely difficult due to the superior resources of the French crown. Military operations resumed in 1227. Royal troops under the command of experienced military leaders methodically recaptured the cities and castles seized by Raymond. The new French strategy involved not only military suppression, but also an economic blockade of the rebellious territories, which gradually undermined the ability of the Languedoc lords to resist. Of particular importance was the Siege of Toulouse, which began in May 1228. The capital of the county was a powerful fortress with a large and loyal population, ready to defend itself to the last. However, the French employed a new tactic. Instead of a direct assault, they surrounded the city with a tight siege, cutting off all supply routes and waiting for the city to surrender due to hunger and disease. The blockade of Toulouse lasted almost a year and became a real test for the defenders. Famine began in the city, epidemics spread, and the fighting spirit of the population gradually declined. Count Raymond made several attempts to break through the siege, but all of them ended in failure. It became clear that further resistance would only lead to unnecessary casualties among the civilian population. The international situation was also not conducive to continuing the war. Pope Gregory IX, preoccupied with a conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor, was interested in bringing the Languedoc conflict to a swift conclusion. The English king was unable to provide real assistance due to his own internal problems. Aragon, weakened by its defeat at Muret, also lacked the resources for active intervention. Under these circumstances, Count Raymond was forced to agree to peace negotiations. The mediators were senior church hierarchs who were interested in ending the bloodshed and restoring church order in the region. The negotiations took place in a difficult atmosphere of mutual distrust, but gradually the parties came to compromise solutions. The Peace of Paris was signed on April 12, 1229, in the presence of Queen Regent Blanche of Castile, Count Raymond of Toulouse, and senior church dignitaries. The terms of the treaty were extremely harsh for the lords of Languedoc, effectively meaning the end of their independence and the incorporation of the region into the French kingdom. Under the treaty, Count Raymond retained power over the eastern part of his domains, but was obliged to recognize himself as a vassal of the French king and comply with all his demands. The western part of the county of Toulouse including the most important cities and fortresses, was directly incorporated into the royal domain. All of Raymond's possessions were to pass to the French crown after his death if he had no sons. Special articles of the treaty concerned religious issues. The Count undertook to actively combat heresy in his territories, to assist the activities of the Inquisition, and to pay the Church substantial compensation for the damage caused by the war. The University of Toulouse was to be founded at the Count's expense to train Catholic theologians capable of effectively combating heretical teachings. The Peace of Paris formally ended the Albigensian Wars, but in fact only marked the transition to a new stage in the fight against the Cathar heresy. Military methods gave way to systematic religious persecution carried out by the Inquisition under the protection of the French Royal Army. The end of active military operations with the Peace of Paris in 1229 did not mean the end of the struggle against the Cathar heresy. On the contrary, now that political resistance had been broken and Languedoc was under the control of the French crown, the Church was able to begin the systematic eradication of heretical beliefs with the help of a new and formidable tool. The reads, Inquisition. The Papal Inquisition was established by Pope Gregory IX in 1231 specifically to combat heresy. Unlike the Episcopal Inquisition that had existed previously, the new organization was directly subordinate to Rome and had extraordinary powers. Its activities in Languedoc began in 1233 and continued several decades, gradually eradicating the last pockets of Cathar resistance. The leadership of the Languedoc Inquisition was entrusted to the Dominican order, founded by Saint Dominic de Guzman during the Albigensian Wars, specifically to combat heresy. Dominican inquisitors were distinguished by their high level of education, deep knowledge of theology, and uncompromising stance on matters of faith. They viewed their mission as a holy war against the devil and his minions. The first Grand Inquisitor of Languedoc was the Dominican Peter Celian, a man of fanatical faith and iron will. Under his leadership, an extensive network of inquisitorial tribunals was established in the largest cities of the region: Toulouse, Carcassonne, Albi, and Béziers. Each tribunal had a staff of qualified lawyers, scribes, executioners, and an extensive network of agents. The methods of the Inquisition differed radically from the military actions of the Crusades. Instead of mass killings, the inquisitors took an individual approach to each suspect of heresy. Thorough investigations were conducted, witnesses were interrogated, and documents were studied. Detailed files were created on all residents of the region, indicating their religious beliefs and connections with heretics. The system of denunciations became a particularly effective weapon of the Inquisition. The inhabitants of Languedoc were obliged, under threat of excommunication, to report to the authorities any manifestations of heresy among their neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances. Anonymous denunciations were encouraged, and testimony against heretics exempted people from punishment for their own sins. This system created an atmosphere of widespread fear and mistrust, and destroyed traditional social ties. The judicial procedure of the Inquisition allowed the use of torture to obtain confessions, which made it virtually impossible for the accused to be acquitted. Cathar perfected ones who fell into the hands of the Inquisition often betrayed their fellow believers in the face of torture, revealing secret hideouts and naming their patrons. In this way, the inquisitors gradually unraveled the entire network of the Cathar organization. The punishments used by the Inquisition ranged from penance and fines to confiscation of property, life imprisonment, and burning at the stake. Unrepentant heretics were handed over to the secular authorities for execution, which formally removed the responsibility for bloodshed from the Church. Mass executions became a common sight in the cities of Languedoc. The confiscation of the property of convicted heretics brought enormous revenues to the Inquisition and the royal treasury. Many wealthy families in Languedoc were completely ruined by accusations of heresy, their lands and capital passing to the Church and the Crown. This economic motivation for the inquisitorial trials created additional incentives for persecution. The fate of the Cathar elite, the perfected ones who formed the spiritual core of the movement, was particularly tragic. Most of them were identified and destroyed during the first 10 years of the Inquisition. Those who remained alive hid in the mountains, but gradually their hideouts were also discovered and destroyed. The last major center of Cathar resistance was the fortress of Montségur in the county of Foix, which was besieged by royal troops in 1243. After a 10-month siege, the castle surrendered, and 215 Cathar, perfected ones, were burned at a huge stake on March 16, 1244. This date is considered the symbolic end of the Cathar movement in Languedoc. The activities of the Inquisition were not limited to the persecution of living heretics. The remains of people posthumously recognized as Cathars were exhumed and burned. Buildings where heretical ceremonies were held were destroyed, and Cathar books and manuscripts were destroyed. The Church sought to erase the very memory of the Cathar movement. The Albigensian Wars and the ensuing Inquisition dealt a crushing blow not only to the Cathar religious movement, but also to the entire distinctive culture of Languedoc. The fate of the troubadour culture, a unique artistic phenomenon that had a huge influence on the development of European poetry and literature, was particularly tragic. In less than half a century, a civilization that had taken centuries to create was destroyed. Troubadours, poets and musicians who wrote in the Occitan language, were an integral part of Languedoc society. Their patrons were the same lords who supported the Cathars: the Counts of Toulouse, the Viscounts of Trinquevel, the Counts of Foix, and many smaller feudal lords. The courts of these magnates served as centers of refined culture, where poetry, music, and philosophical debates flourished. The poetry of the troubadours was distinguished by its refined form and depth of content. They created the concept of courtly love, extolled knightly ideals, and developed complex poetic forms. Masters such as Arnaud Daniel, Père Vidal, Bertrand de Born, and Rimbaud d'Orange created works that were studied and imitated throughout Europe. Dante called Arnaud Daniel the best smith of his native language. The military actions of the Crusades dealt the first blow to the culture of the troubadours. Many courts were destroyed, their owners killed or exiled, libraries and archives destroyed. Simon de Montfort and his successors did not understand the value of Languedoc culture and regarded it as part of a heretical heritage that had to be eradicated. The northern French conquerors brought with them different cultural traditions and a different language. The fate of those troubadours who openly supported the Cathar movement or defended the independence of Languedoc was particularly tragic. Many of them were forced to leave their homeland and seek refuge in other countries. Pere Cardinal, one of the greatest poets of the era, devoted his entire life to denouncing the Crusaders and the Inquisition. His Cervantes, political songs, are full of anger against the destroyers of his native culture. Folquet de Marseille is a tragic example of a troubadour who betrayed his ideals. The former poet became a Cistercian monk, then Bishop of Toulouse, and an active participant in the Inquisition. He persecuted his former colleagues and contributed to the destruction of the culture of which he himself had once been a part. This case symbolized the spiritual catastrophe of the era. The Occitan language, in which the troubadours wrote, was systematically suppressed. The French administration imposed the use of the Northern French language in official documents, court proceedings, and education. The Church also contributed to linguistic unification, considering Occitan to be the language of heretics. Gradually, the Occitan language lost its prestige and social functions. The University of Toulouse, founded in 1229 under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, became an instrument of cultural assimilation. Unlike the old educational centers of Languedoc, where intellectual freedom flourished, the new university was created specifically to train Catholic theologians and lawyers. Its task was not to develop local culture, but to replace it with orthodox Catholic scholarship. The architectural heritage of Languedoc also suffered from military action and subsequent persecution. Many castles were destroyed or rebuilt in accordance with northern French models. Churches where Cathar ceremonies were held were desecrated and rebuilt. The region's Romanesque architecture, distinguished by its particular refinement, gradually gave way to the Gothic forms introduced by the conquerors. The economic foundations of Languedoc culture were undermined by property confiscations and high taxes imposed on the region. Many wealthy families, who had traditionally patronized the arts, were ruined or expelled. The trade links that had nourished the region's economic prosperity were disrupted by military action and political changes. Some elements of Languedoc culture found continuation in other parts of Europe. Troubadours fleeing persecution brought their traditions to Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Dante, Petrarch, and other great poets studied under Languedoc masters. However, the mother culture itself was irretrievably lost. The memory of the golden age of Languedoc civilization was preserved in the folk traditions of the region. Legends about the times of independence, about the wise Cathar saints, and about the valiant defenders of their native land were passed down from generation to generation. This oral tradition became the basis for the Romantic rehabilitation of Languedoc culture in the 19th century, when Europe rediscovered the heritage of the troubadours. The destruction of Languedoc culture was one of the greatest cultural catastrophes of the Middle Ages. A unique synthesis of various traditions, Romanesque, Arab, Jewish, Byzantine, that created a unique cultural phenomenon was lost. European civilization lost one of its most vivid manifestations, and the process of cultural unification received a powerful impetus. Modern researchers and lovers of historical mysteries often ask themselves, what exactly frightened the Catholic Church so much about the Cathar teachings that it required such radical measures to destroy them? A number of theories suggest that the Cathars possessed some secret knowledge or documents that posed an existential threat to papal authority and official Christian doctrine. One of the most common versions links the Cathars to the legendary Holy Grail, the cup from which, according to legend, Christ drank at the Last Supper, and into which Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood of the crucified Savior. Some researchers claim that the Cathars were the guardians of this greatest Christian relic, and the esoteric knowledge associated with it about the nature of Christ and true Christianity. The Cathars' connection to the Grail is allegedly confirmed by the fact that the fortress of Montségur, the last stronghold of Cathar resistance, was sometimes referred to in medieval texts as the Castle of the Grail. Proponents of this theory point out that before the surrender of Montségur, 4 Cathar perfects managed to escape from the besieged fortress with some valuable items. What exactly they took with them remains a mystery. Another theory suggests that the Cathars possessed alternative gospels, or early Christian texts, that contained information about the life and teachings of Christ that differed radically from the official church version. Perhaps these documents questioned the divinity of Christ, his resurrection, or other fundamental dogmas of Catholicism. Such texts did exist in the early Christian period, but most of them were destroyed by the Church in the first centuries of Christianity. The Cathar teaching of dualism and the evil nature of the material world did have its roots in ancient Gnostic traditions, which the Church had always considered particularly dangerous. Gnostics claimed to possess secret knowledge about the nature of God and the universe, which was supposedly passed down through a chain of initiates from Christ himself. If the Cathars were indeed heirs to the Gnostic tradition, they may have possessed texts and practices unknown to the official church. Some researchers link the Cathars to the Order of the Knights Templar, which was founded during the Crusades and was also brutally persecuted in the early 14th century. The Templars spent a long time in the East, where they could have become acquainted with various esoteric teachings. There is evidence of contact between the Templars and Cathar communities, although the nature of this relationship remains unclear. The financial power of the Cathar communities may also explain the Church's interest in their destruction. The Cathars controlled significant material resources in one of the richest regions of Europe. Their perfect ones, who renounced personal property, transferred all their possessions to the community, which allowed them to accumulate enormous capital. The confiscation of Cathar property greatly enriched the Church and the French crown. The intellectual threat posed by the Cathars was no less serious than the material one. Cathar perfected ones were distinguished by their high level of education, deep knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, and ability to conduct theological debates. Their criticism of the Catholic Church was based on a thorough study of early Christian sources and resonated with the educated classes. This undermined the intellectual monopoly of the Church. The political aspects of the Cathar threat were closely linked to the religious ones. The Cathar movement effectively created an alternative church organization with its own hierarchy, financial system, and ideology. This called into question not only the religious, but also the political authority of the papacy. The successful existence of the Cathar Church could serve as an example for other heretical movements in Europe. Some modern researchers believe that the Cathars may have possessed knowledge in the fields of natural sciences, medicine, and astronomy, which in medieval Europe were often considered magical or heretical. Their connections with Muslim Spain and Byzantium may have contributed to the penetration of Eastern scholarship into Languedoc. Such knowledge posed a threat to the scholastic education system controlled by the Church. The question of the Cathars' secret knowledge remains open due to the almost complete destruction of Cathar sources by the Inquisition. Virtually all information about Cathar teachings has come down to us through hostile Catholic sources, which makes it difficult to objectively assess their actual beliefs and practices. Modern science can only build hypotheses based on fragmentary data. Regardless of whether the Cathars possessed any special secrets, the very fact of their mass extermination indicates that the Church perceived them as a mortal threat. Perhaps the greatest danger was not some specific secret knowledge, but the very model of alternative Christianity, which could inspire other opposition movements throughout Europe. The Albigensian Wars, which lasted from 1209 to 1229, were a turning point in the history of medieval Europe, having a profound and lasting impact on the development of the Church, France, and the entire continent. The consequences of this conflict were felt for many centuries and largely determined the further course of European history. For the Catholic Church, the Albigensian Crusade became an important precedent for the use of military force against Christian heretics on European soil. For the first time in history, the papacy officially called for a holy war against European Christians, which radically expanded the concept of the Crusades. This precedent was later used to organize military expeditions against the Hussites, Orthodox peoples, and other heretics. The creation of the papal inquisition as a permanent institution for combating heresy was a direct consequence of the poor Albigensian experience. The methods developed in Languedoc, a system of denunciations, the use of torture, confiscation of property, and mass executions, spread throughout Europe and persisted until modern times. The Inquisition became a powerful tool of church control over society. The Dominican order, created specifically to combat Cathar heresy, became one of the most important monastic orders of the Catholic Church. The Dominicans took over the leadership of the Inquisition, developed scholastic theology, and engaged in education and preaching. Their activities largely determined the intellectual landscape of the late Middle Ages. For the French kingdom, the Albigensian Wars meant the largest territorial acquisition since the time of Philip II Augustus. The annexation of Languedoc doubled the territory of the royal domain and turned France into the dominant power in Western Europe. The riches of the conquered region provided the French crown with the material resources for further expansion. The administrative integration of Languedoc into the French kingdom was accompanied by the creation of new institutions of government. The system of seneschalships introduced in the south became a model for the unification of the French administration. The gradual replacement of local law by Roman and canon law contributed to the centralization of the legal system. The language policy of the French crown led to the gradual replacement of Occitan from official use. Although Occitan continued to exist as a spoken language, its prestige and social functions steadily declined. This was an important step in the formation of French linguistic and cultural identity. The economic consequences of the wars were twofold. On the one hand, the military actions caused enormous damage to the economy of Languedoc. Cities were destroyed, fields were devastated, and trade links were disrupted. On the other hand, the inclusion of the region into the French kingdom opened up new opportunities for trade and economic development under the protection of a strong central authority. The social structure of Languedoc society underwent radical changes. The old feudal elite was partly destroyed, partly expelled, and partly assimilated. Its place was taken by northern French lords who received confiscated lands. This led to a profound transformation of social relations and cultural traditions in the region. For the development of European civilization, the destruction of Languedoc culture was an irreparable loss. The unique tradition of religious tolerance, which allowed different faiths to coexist peacefully, disappeared. One of the most sophisticated cultures of medieval Europe, which had a huge influence on the development of poetry and literature, was destroyed. The Albigensian Wars became an important stage in the formation of nation-states in Europe. They demonstrated the possibility of using religious motivation for political expansion and cultural unification. This experience was later used by many European monarchs to strengthen central power. International relations in Europe were also affected by the Albigensian conflict. Aragon's defeat at Muret weakened its position in southern France and contributed to the reorientation of Aragonese policy towards the Mediterranean. The strengthening of France changed the European balance of power and laid the foundations for future conflicts with England and the Holy Roman Empire. The Albigensian Wars laid the foundations for the development of the concept of just war in the Christian world. They showed that religious motives could justify the most brutal military actions against fellow believers. This precedent was later used to justify the religious wars of the Reformation. In the long term, the destruction of Catharism contributed to the strengthening of Orthodox Catholicism and the suppression of religious diversity in Europe. However, it failed to prevent the emergence of new heretical movements, which ultimately led to the Reformation and the schism of Western Christianity. The Albigensian experience demonstrated both the power and the limits of the medieval church in combating dissent. The memory of the Albigensian Wars was preserved in the folk tradition of Languedoc and became an important element of regional identity. In the 19th and 20th centuries, this memory was revived by movements for cultural autonomy and the revival of the Occitan language. The Cathars became a symbol of the struggle for freedom of conscience and cultural diversity.